Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that I quite recently started a new series. I've been analysing and discussing fictional characters from various books, movies and video games, and doing a breakdown for them. Most of the characters I've talked about so far have been either villains or morally ambiguous characters who I personally find interesting and enigmatic in some way. When it comes to the Elder Scrolls, I've made no secret that it's one of my personal favourite video game series of all time, and in my personal opinion the most fascinating and interesting game in the series is Morrowind. I've spoken in previous videos about how Morrowind had more interesting and nuanced RPG elements that made the game so much more interactive and added a significant amount of replay value and playstyles. In addition to this, Morrowind had by far the most interesting story and the most interesting writing. This is particularly true in regards to the main villain, Dagoth Ur, aka Vorin Dagoth. So Dagoth Ur is a villain who is particularly interesting and particularly enigmatic, not to mention truly terrifying, not only due to his power and presence, but also because you may notice that his backstory and his ideology are deliberately ambiguous and confusing, but at the same time, they don't feel in any way forced or contrived. Throughout the story of Morrowind, you learn about the lore and the history of the region by traversing the game and reading various accounts of Morrowind's history and culture from a sizable amount of unreliable narrators. Morrowind is an extremely hostile, volatile and divided land, with a variety of powerful and ideologically possessed factions, all vying for disputed land and disputed agendas. You have several religious factions, each with their own spiritual and cultural values, as well as accounts of history, each of which conflict with one another. And you also have factions that have more outsider and imperialistic influences, such as great houses, tribes, military legions, service guilds and several others. Seriously, Morrowind has so many varying factions, some of which are mutually exclusive that you could spend hours analysing the conflicting opinions and ideologies of each, but I digress. Without getting too deep into the overall history, culture and lore of Morrowind, or the wider Elder Scrolls universe, I want to talk specifically about Dagoth Ur and his story, as well as the events of Morrowind's history that relate specifically to him. Let's talk about it. So the history of Morrowind consists of wars between several different races, each vying for control of the province, more specifically the Chimer, the Dwemer and the Nords, all of which attempted at some point to conquer and dominate the region. The history of the Chimer begins with their succession from the High Elves of the Somerset Isles, who they weren't much different from in the early days. When migrating to Morrowind, however, they differed from the other races of elves in the sense that they refused to support the generally accepted religion that was more prolific in elven culture, the Divines as they are known in the Elder Scrolls lore, who depending on who you ask are viewed as the good deities. The Chimer instead decided to worship the Daedra, who are generally considered to be evil demonic entities who treat mortal races with cruelty. The Chimer for some reason viewed the Daedra as their ancestors. While this was disputed by pretty much all the other elven races, the one race that they clashed with the most was the Dwemer. Like the Chimer, the Dwemer were a race of elves who had split from the other elven races, and had an ideology and culture of their own. However, unlike the Chimer, who worshipped the evil Daedra, the Dwemer refused to worship any of the deities, instead deciding to mock and reject them. This led to the Dwemer becoming a race that saw themselves above all others, wanting to use profane rituals and dangerous technology to in a way ascend to godhood, which the Chimer were deeply offended by. This led to a war between both races over their ideological differences. However, before this war broke out, the two races are said to have joined forces to repel an invasion from the Nords of Skyrim, who by their way have their own version of these events, but we'll get to that later. This alliance is formed between the respective leaders of each race, Indoril Nerevar of the Chimer and Dumac'S Dwarf King of the Dwemer. These two leaders, while ideologically opposed to each other, were able to become friends and allies. This alliance would not last since various members of each had their own agenda. While the two races continued their uneasy alliance, Kagranak, who was a chief Dwemer architect, discovered an artifact in the heart of Red Mountain, which dominated the centre of the island of Fardenfell which is the north part of Morrowind. This item was believed to be the heart of Lokan, the divine responsible for the creation of Nirn, who the Nords call Shor. The divine power contained within the heart was far too unstable for any mortal to handle. The Dwemer, however, in their arrogance, saw themselves above the other mortal races. Kagrenac used the heart for his own agenda, building a huge golem known as the Numidium, which would be powered by the heart, and used to force the entire Dwemer race to ascend to godhood, as they had been trying to do for many years. When the Chimer found out about this, Nerevar's chief council, known as the Tribunal, Vivec, Almalexia and Sophisil, convinced Nerevar to wage war on the Dwemer. Despite the long friendship between Nerevar and Dumac, the war broke out between the two races, and this war culminated in the Battle of Red Mountain. What's very interesting about the Battle of Red Mountain is that it's an event that is largely confusing, with several different factions and characters recounting the events differently. Without going into too much detail, because this is a profile for a specific character, I don't want to discuss every single theory or account of what happened at Red Mountain, because believe me, it's very confusing and very complicated, but with a tremendous amount of conflicting information and accounts that are unreliable at best, we do have a rough idea of what happened. What we know about the event is that it resulted in Nerevar and Dumac'S deaths, as well as Dagoth Ur, who was the leader of one of the great houses of the Chimer, being seduced by the power of the heart, as well as the Tribunal using Kagrenac's tools to extract divine power from the heart, essentially becoming demigods, who went on to rule over the Chimer. As for Kagrenac, he is said to have struck the heart, and in an instant the entire Dwemer race vanished from Tamriel, never to be seen again. Due to the actions of the Tribunal, the Daedra Azura appeared before them and cursed the entire Chimer race on their behalf. The Chimer were at this point given grey skin and red eyes, later being known as the Dunmer, or Dark Elves. Dagoth, on the other hand, after being cut down and left for dead, was presumed to be dead. As I mentioned before, it's very unclear on what actually happened during these events, and the accounts you're given about them vary depending on which character you talk to and who tells you the story. This is particularly true as it relates to Dagoth Ur and his involvement in the events. Some accounts say that Dagoth aided the Chimer in defeating the Dwemer. Others say he betrayed them and sided with the Dwemer. Other accounts say that Dagoth actually sided with the Nords, who themselves wanted to acquire and rescue the heart of Shor, only for him to later betray them and lead to their defeat. Some accounts say that it was Dagoth who murdered Nerevar and attempted to control the heart of Lokan himself. Others say that this is a lie, and that it was the Tribunal, most notably Vivec, who betrayed and murdered Nerevar, turning his back on the Chimer for his own reasons. Whatever the case may be, the fact of the matter is that Dagoth was for thousands of years believed to be dead. As time went on, the Tribunal, now worshipped as demigods, ruled over Morrowind, which for many generations saw relative peace. However, there were several factions, most notably the Ashlander tribes, who rejected the Tribunal and continued the profane Daedra worship of the old Chimer. Despite the fact that the Tribunal had led Morrowind through many crises, during this time, Morrowind was also in a sense conquered by the Imperial Empire, led by Tiber Septim, who made a deal with the Tribunal to allow them a certain amount of autonomy in exchange for Imperial occupation of Morrowind, as well as the Numidium, which the Tribunal had acquired after the disappearance of the Dwemer. This angered many of the Dunmer, who saw this as selling out to the Empire, who they saw as beneath them, and ideologically opposed to them. As tensions and divisions between the Dunmer and various factions of Morrowind continued to escalate, in the heart of Red Mountain an evil began to grow. Dagoth Ur had awoken. He had made some kind of profane bond with the heart of Lokan, and using the heart's power, he began to fester and scheme. In secret, Dagoth had created several profane concoctions, including a blight that came from the ashes of Red Mountain, tainting the land around it, turning it into a barren wasteland, killing the plants and wildlife of the area, as well as anybody who dared to come near. Those who happened to survive the blight were afflicted with horrific diseases, in particular the Corpus disease, in addition to turning anybody who contracts it into a hideously grotesque mess, it also came with a more disturbing affliction. It turns its victim into a mindless zombie with a direct link to Red Mountain. Dagoth Ur used this, as well as his divine power, to enslave the minds of the people of Morrowind, essentially creating a hive mind with him in control and removing their free will. Dagoth, in his madness, believed that he was destined to rule Morrowind. He believed that only through direct control would the people of Morrowind be free from the Empire and the tyrannical rule of every single outsider. The disturbing thing about this is that Dagoth is a character who is ideologically possessed and utterly delusional about his views. He was essentially a totalitarian dictator who seeks to mentally enslave his people. In addition to that, the same madness that Kagrenac before him had fell prey to was clear with Dagoth as he attempted to create his own golem, the second Numidium, also known as Akulakan, which he had built in secret. Using the Blight Disease as well as Akulakan, Dagoth Ur planned to not only dominate and enslave the minds of the people of Morrowind, but also the entirety of Tamriel. He schemed from an abandoned Dwemer ruin within Red Mountain to essentially take over the entire continent of Tamriel by becoming its hive mind, which of course would have been a horrible and utterly terrifying turn of events, essentially taking away the very humanity of the continent. Free will is something that as a Christian I truly believe is God-given, and it's something that those who seek to control us would like to take away from us for their own ideology, that requires unquestioned obedience. Dagoth Ur represents the absolute madness and delusion of those who would seek to rule over us, and have us live with a hive mind mentality. But what makes him particularly interesting, from the perspective of an observer like myself, who likes to talk about the ideologies and motivations of villains, is that he genuinely believes that what he's doing is morally good. He believes that by mutilating and disfiguring the Dunmer, he is in a sense liberating them from the curse placed upon them by Azura, and rescuing them from the actions of the Tribunal. This is of course utter madness, and there is no way you could ever provide a credible argument that this is a good thing. It's just sheer madness. But from the perspective of a mad demigod with thousands of years of festering hatred, and an uncontrollable sense of superiority with delusions of grandeur on a particularly large scale, Dagoth was beyond reason. Dagoth is interesting when compared to the other Elder Scrolls villains in the sense that there is so much intrigue and mystery surrounding him, and it's unclear whether or not he's a truly unambiguously evil villain, or a corrupted hero who means well but became brainwashed and seduced by his own power and his own confusing ideology that there isn't a whole lot of information on. One thing is for sure though, he is utterly terrifying and disturbing. Despite remaining in Red Mountain, he is able to enter the dreams of the people of Morrowind, twisting their minds and implanting thoughts in their heads. Mind control and a corruption of free will are constant themes surrounding Dagoth Ur, and it makes him a lot more confusing and intimidating than most of the video game villains, including the other villains in Elder Scrolls. To sum up, let's briefly discuss the events of Morrowind. So the game begins with you, an unnamed prisoner, waking up on a prison ship being released in Morrowind. Long story short, you find out that the Emperor Uriel Septim, who is Dragonborn, has had a dream that revealed to him the coming of the Nerevarine prophecies, referring to the returning of Nerevar to defeat Dagoth Ur and expose the Tribunal, uniting the people of Morrowind. It turns out you, the player, are the Nerevarine. You unite the tribes and great houses, become the Hortator, and ultimately journey to Red Mountain, defeating Dagoth Ur and shattering the heart of Lokan. Dagoth is finally defeated, and the supposed reincarnation of his old leader Nerevar becomes the saviour of Morrowind. In addition to this, the Blight is destroyed, and the people of Morrowind are free of Dagoth's control, saving the Empire in the process. This is of course a very short and simplified explanation of the game's main story, but I wanted to stay on topic and not get sidetracked. Nonetheless, Dagoth Ur is a well-written, terrifying and yet fascinating villain that I think was one of the most memorable in the entire series. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed making this video. Stay tuned for more character breakdowns as well as video game reviews, Be sure to check out my video game review series, as well as my other character profiles if you want to. Thanks for watching and God bless.
But let the weeping cease. The blight is gone, and the sun's golden honey gilds the land.